You talked about someone who wasn't in the room today. Almost certainly. Maybe it was harmless. Who's dating who? What someone said at work. A story about a mutual friend's terrible decision. Maybe it had a little bit of an edge to it. Either way, you did it. You probably did it more than once. And you didn't think of it as a big deal. Here's the thing worth sitting with for a second. Researchers who've actually measured this have found that gossip, broadly defined as talking about people who aren't present, makes up somewhere around two-thirds of all everyday human conversation. Not occasionally. Not as some embarrassing exception to how we normally talk. Two-thirds. It's not a flaw in human social behavior. It's most of what social behavior actually consists of, once you strip away the parts about weather and traffic. So the question worth asking isn't whether you gossip. You obviously do, everyone does, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of social performance. The real question is whether this goes back. Whether early humans, tens of thousands of years ago, sitting around a fire with no bank accounts and no office politics and no smartphones, were doing the same thing you did at lunch today. Talking about the person who wasn't there. The honest answer isn't a simple yes with a date attached to it. It's a case built from several angles that point in the same direction, and it's worth laying those out carefully rather than just asserting the conclusion. Let's start with the most direct evolutionary argument because it comes from a researcher who built an entire influential theory specifically around this question. Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist who spent years studying primate social behavior before turning to humans, noticed something specific about how other primates maintain social bonds. Chimpanzees, baboons, and other social primates spend an enormous amount of time grooming each other, physically picking through fur, removing parasites, generally handling one another's bodies. This isn't just hygiene. Grooming is the primary mechanism by which primates build and maintain trust, alliances, and social rank. Who grooms whom and how often maps almost directly onto the social structure of the group. The problem with grooming as a social bonding mechanism is that it doesn't scale. It's one-to-one. You can only groom one individual at a time, and grooming takes real time, sometimes hours a day in larger primate groups. Dunbar found a direct relationship across primate species between group size and the amount of time spent grooming. Larger groups require more social maintenance, which requires more grooming time, until you hit a ceiling where there simply aren't enough hours in the day to groom everyone you'd need to maintain a relationship with. This creates a hard mathematical limit on how large a primate group can get before it becomes socially unstable. Before the bonds holding it together simply can't be maintained with the physical time available. For most primates, this ceiling sits somewhere around 50 individuals. Beyond that, the math doesn't work. There isn't enough grooming time in an average day to maintain that many relationships one at a time, physically with your hands. Human social groups, historically and in the archaeological and ethnographic record, tend to run considerably larger than that. Dunbar's own research, extending this logic to humans by comparing brain size across primate species, arrived at a now famous number. Roughly 150 stable social relationships as the practical ceiling for a human being, sometimes called Dunbar's number. This shows up with surprising consistency across very different kinds of human groups. The typical size of hunter-gatherer bands scaled up to their broader clan networks, the size of historical military companies, the size at which informal organizations tend to need to start adding formal structure to keep functioning. So here's Dunbar's actual argument, and it's the part that connects directly to gossip. If grooming caps out around 50 individuals, but humans regularly maintain social networks 3 times that size, something had to replace grooming as the bonding mechanism. Something that could maintain trust and social information at a distance, across multiple people, without requiring physical one-to-one contact for every single relationship. Dunbar's proposal is that language did this job, and specifically that talking about other people, gossip, in the broad and non-judgmental sense of the word, is what took over grooming's function. You can gossip with one person about a third person who isn't present. In that single conversation, you're maintaining your relationship with the person you're talking to, and simultaneously updating your information about the person you're talking about without touching either of them. One conversation does the social work that would have required 2 separate one-on-one grooming sessions in a chimpanzee troop. Language, in this view, isn't primarily a tool for describing the physical world. It's a tool that let human social bonding scale past the hard ceiling that grooming imposed on every other primate. This is a genuinely elegant argument, and it explains something that would otherwise be strange. Why so much of ordinary human conversation is about other people's relationships, behavior, and reputations, rather than about hunting strategy or tool making or the weather. If Dunbar is right, that's not a distraction from the real purpose of language. That is the real purpose, or at least one of the central original ones. The honest caveat here is important. Dunbar's grooming to gossip hypothesis is influential and widely cited, but it remains a theory, not a settled fact confirmed by direct evidence from tens of thousands of years ago. We don't have a recording of a Paleolithic conversation to check whether it was actually about who wasn't sharing meat fairly or who was flirting with whose partner. What we have is a strong structural argument. The mathematical relationship between group size and social maintenance time is real and measurable across living primates. The scaling problem it describes is real, and language is demonstrably capable of solving it in exactly the way Dunbar proposes. The argument is inference built on solid comparative biology, not a direct transcript of ancient behavior. Now let's move to a second independent line of evidence, because gossip's usefulness isn't just about maintaining friendly bonds, it's also, more bluntly, about tracking who can and can't be trusted. This is where a separate and equally well-supported body of research comes in on what's often called reputation-based cooperation. In any group where individuals depend on each other for survival, sharing food, coordinating a hunt, defending against threats, caring for each other's children, the single most valuable piece of information you can have about another person is whether they're reliable. Do they share fairly? Do they follow through on commitments? Do they take more than they give? Are they dangerous to be around? You could, in principle, gather all of this information firsthand by personally interacting with and observing every single member of your group over a long period. But this is slow, and worse, it's genuinely risky. If the only way to find out someone is a cheat or a bully is to personally get cheated or bullied by them first, that's an expensive way to learn. Gossip solves this problem by making reputation information transferable. If someone in your group cheats another member during a hunt and that information spreads through conversation, everyone else in the group can update their assessment of that person without personally having to be cheated first. Researchers studying cooperation in both humans and other social species have found that the ability to transmit reputation information secondhand, through communication rather than direct experience, dramatically increases the stability of cooperative groups because it makes cheating far more costly. A cheater in a group with gossip isn't just risking one bad interaction. They're risking their reputation with everyone in the network, delivered by people they never even directly wronged. This connects to something called indirect reciprocity in evolutionary biology and game theory. The idea that cooperation can be sustained in a group not just by direct tit-for-tat exchanges between two individuals, but by a group-wide tracking of who deserves cooperation based on their reputation, built and maintained through observation and communication about third parties. Multiple researchers modeling the evolution of cooperation have found that reputation systems, sustained through exactly the kind of information transfer we'd call gossip, are one of the more robust mechanisms for maintaining large-scale cooperation among unrelated individuals. A problem that simpler mechanisms like direct reciprocity or kin selection struggle to solve once a group gets large enough that you're regularly interacting with people you're not related to and won't necessarily interact with again soon. This gives gossip a second independent evolutionary justification beyond Dunbar's bonding argument. It's not just social glue, it's a decentralized enforcement mechanism. A group that talks about who cheated, who lied, who failed to share, is a group that makes cheating expensive without needing a formal court, a police force, or a written law. The gossip itself is the enforcement. Now, does this mean specifically Paleolithic humans were doing this in something recognizable as conversation tens of thousands of years ago? Here the evidence gets more indirect, and it's worth being honest about exactly what kind of evidence we're working with. We don't have direct behavioral evidence of Paleolithic conversation content for the obvious reason that speech doesn't fossilize. What we have instead is a convergence of several separate lines of reasoning. First, the archaeological and genetic evidence for the emergence of complex language capacity in the human lineage points to a timeline stretching back at least many tens of thousands of years, and by some estimates considerably longer, well before any written record. Second, contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, studied directly by anthropologists as the closest living approximation we have to small-scale, pre-agricultural social organization, show gossip as a large and functionally important part of daily conversation, used explicitly to track cooperation, flag rule violations, and manage reputations within the group, in ways that researchers studying these societies have described in detail. Third, the underlying mathematical and evolutionary logic, the grooming ceiling, the reputation tracking advantage, doesn't depend on any specific technology or cultural sophistication. It depends only on having a language capable of referring to absent third parties, which is a very basic linguistic capability that almost certainly predates complex toolmaking, agriculture, and settled life by a wide margin. Put together, this is a strong circumstantial case rather than direct proof. It doesn't tell us the specific content of any particular ancient conversation. It does suggest that as soon as early humans had language sophisticated enough to talk about people who weren't present, the same evolutionary pressures that make gossip useful today, bonding at scale, reputation tracking, enforcement of cooperation, would have applied with just as much force to a small band around a fire as they do to you at a lunch table. There's a piece of supporting evidence worth adding here because it comes from an unexpected place. The content of gossip itself and how consistent it is across dramatically different human societies. Anthropologists and psychologists who have specifically studied what people gossip about across a wide range of documented cultures with little to no contact with each other have found the content is remarkably consistent. The overwhelming majority of gossip across cultures concerns exactly two categories: violations of social norms, cheating, lying, unfairness, breaking of trust, and information relevant to mating and alliances, who's interested in whom, who's a good or bad potential partner, who's forming or breaking alliances. This cross-cultural consistency is, structurally, the same kind of evidence we've relied on elsewhere in the deep history of human behavior. When a very specific pattern shows up independently, over and over in populations with no historical contact, it's a signal that something universal and probably old is being tracked rather than something locally invented and culturally transmitted by chance. If gossip were simply an arbitrary cultural habit that happened to develop independently and coincidentally take a similar shape everywhere, you'd expect much more variation in what people actually talk about. Instead, the topics cluster tightly around exactly the two categories that matter most for the two evolutionary functions already described: cooperation and reputation on one hand, mating, and alliance formation on the other. That tight clustering is itself a form of evidence, even without a fossil or a recording to point to directly. Let's also be fair to the more skeptical read of all this, because a good case accounts for its own limits. It's worth being clear that gossip, as studied by modern researchers, and whatever conversational behavior existed around a Paleolithic campfire are not identical things, and treating them as interchangeable would be overreaching. Modern gossip research is conducted in a world with language, complex social structures, and cultural transmission mechanisms that took tens of thousands of years to develop after the point we're actually asking about. The most honest version of the claim isn't that we know exactly what Paleolithic humans said to each other. It's that the underlying selective pressures, the grooming ceiling, the value of secondhand reputation information, the advantage of tracking who can be trusted without personally testing every individual, were already present the moment humans had language capable of referencing people who weren't there. And those pressures don't require modern civilization to operate. They only require groups, cooperation, and speech. There's one more dimension worth examining, because it complicates the picture in an honest way rather than simply reinforcing it. The difference between gossip that helps a group and gossip that harms it. Not all gossip functions the same way, and researchers studying this distinction have found it matters more than the simple fact of talking about someone. Psychologists studying gossip in modern group settings have identified what's sometimes called prosocial gossip, Sharing accurate information about someone's untrustworthy or harmful behavior, specifically to warn others and protect the group, as functionally distinct from gossip that's simply cruel, inaccurate, or self serving, aimed at damaging someone's standing without any real basis. Both get called gossip in casual usage. They do very different jobs. Prosocial gossip, in laboratory studies of cooperation, has been shown to measurably increase group wide cooperation and reduce cheating, precisely because it functions as the enforcement mechanism described earlier. A cheater's reputation spreads. Other people avoid trusting or cooperating with them, and the incentive to cheat in the first place goes down because the cost of being caught has gone up. Groups that permit this kind of information sharing about bad behavior consistently outperform groups where people can't warn each other, in terms of overall cooperation and resistance to exploitation by free riders. This has been demonstrated repeatedly in behavioral economics experiments using cooperative games where researchers can directly manipulate whether participants are allowed to share information about each other's past behavior. But gossip that isn't accurate or that's driven by envy, rivalry, or simple cruelty rather than a genuine warning function doesn't have the same effect. It can fracture group cohesion instead of strengthening it, damage innocent people's reputations, and in the worst cases become a tool used by coalitions within a group to attack and exclude specific individuals for reasons that have nothing to do with actual trustworthiness. Anthropologists studying gossip in traditional societies have documented both patterns clearly. Gossip used to genuinely flag a freeloader or a cheat, and gossip used as a weapon in personal rivalries, factional conflict, or simple social cruelty, with the two often difficult to distinguish from the outside, and sometimes difficult to distinguish even from the inside. This matters for the deep history question because it suggests gossip was never a simple, uniformly beneficial mechanism, even in principle. It's a tool with real teeth, capable of protecting a group from exploitation and equally capable of being turned into a weapon inside that same group. If the evolutionary pressures described earlier are correct, this dual nature likely isn't a modern corruption of some purer ancient version. It's probably always been this way. The same capacity for language that let early humans track real cheaters also gave them the capacity to spread false or exaggerated claims about people they simply didn't like, and there's no obvious mechanism by which evolution would have selected only for the honest prosocial version while filtering out the self-interested one. Both versions serve the individual doing the talking, at least in the short term, which is precisely the kind of thing natural selection tends to preserve rather than eliminate. This gives the deep history of gossip a more complicated, more honest shape than a simple story of ancient humans nobly enforcing fairness around the campfire. It was very likely doing both things from the start, building trust and spreading useful warnings in one conversation, and settling grudges or currying favor through exaggeration or fabrication in the next, with the people involved not always able to tell in the moment which one they were actually participating in. So did ancient humans gossip? The most defensible answer is this. As soon as early humans possessed language sophisticated enough to talk about a third party who wasn't present, the same evolutionary and social pressures that make gossip functionally important today were already fully in place. Group size scaling past what grooming alone could maintain, the need to track who was reliable and who wasn't, without personally testing every member of the group. The advantage in a cooperative species of making cheating expensive through reputation rather than direct confrontation. None of these pressures are modern inventions. They're structural features of living in groups large enough that you can't personally verify everyone's character firsthand. This doesn't prove the specific content of any conversation held around any particular fire tens of thousands of years ago, but it makes a genuinely strong case that what you did at lunch today, talking about someone who wasn't in the room, tracking who's trustworthy, quietly updating your sense of who deserves your cooperation and who doesn't, is not a modern indulgence or a character flaw. It's one of the oldest, most structurally important things language was ever used for. The next time you catch yourself mid-sentence talking about someone who isn't there, understand what you're actually doing, not wasting time, not being petty, running the exact same system that let a species with weak claws and no fur build groups large enough and trustworthy enough to survive at all.